What's up, everybody? This is Craig, and this is day 26 of my 30-day video challenge. In today's video, I want to talk about the key to producing your best work. In his book, The Practice, Seth Godin talks about what he calls attachment. He goes into more detail and he phrases it as attachment to outcomes. In Western culture, we tend to think of our work in terms of outcomes. We phrase everything around the outcomes. We are creating things based on outcomes we want to achieve. I thought this idea of outcomes and attachment to outcomes was an incredibly unique perspective that I wanted to share with you, just to give us some insight into this idea of what attachment is. I found an article in Forbes that was written by Dara Brustein, and I want to take a clip or a small quote out of it to kind of frame our discussion. Dara is asking several questions to Seth in this article, and Seth answers these in a Q&A or a question and answer format. I'm going to read Dara's question, and then I'm going to follow that by Seth Godin's response. So Dara says, "You also shared that it's important to do the work without attachment to a specific outcome. When one is accustomed to judging his, her, or their success on the outcome, how do you suggest they shift their perspective on this?" And here is Seth Godin's response. "Attachment means being willing and working to make something happen that is out of your control. And that will destroy your work because you don't know how to do that. All you can do is your best version of you doing your best version of the work, simply that. And when we become attached to the outcome, we end up imitating other people. We end up coming up with a paint by numbers approach because it's deniable. And what I'm arguing for is yes, you need a feedback loop, but no, you can't be attached to it." So when we're producing work, regardless of what it is, but specifically when we're producing creative work, when we get too attached to the outcome of our work, it is a huge danger to not only us, but to the work at hand. In an interview with Brian Elliott from Behind the Brand, Seth gives some great insight surrounding a TED Talk from Elizabeth Gilbert. So Elizabeth Gilbert, if you're not familiar with her work, she is famous for the book Eat, Pray, Love. So in this interview between Brian Elliott and Seth Godin, Brian asks Seth about this idea that is presented by Elizabeth Gilbert in this TED Talk that was following her fame with Eat, Pray, Love. In this TED Talk, Elizabeth Gilbert talked about how people would approach her following her success with Eat, Pray, Love. And so I'm going to do my best to summarize, and I will also pull quotes from there as well. So she says that after releasing her hit book, Eat, Pray, Love, people would ask her a series of questions. And these questions are pulled from that TED Talk. So these are quoted from that TED Talk. So it says, people would come up and ask her questions like, "Aren't you afraid you'll never be able to top that?" The second one was, "Aren't you afraid you're going to keep writing for your whole life and you're never again going to create a book that anybody in the world cares about at all ever again?" These questions and the story kind of further solidifies this idea of being attached to the outcome. Following her success, Elizabeth was writing another book, and she was at the copy shop printing out her only copy of this new book. I guess her editor or her book agent had asked her to write another book, kind of to follow up Eat, Pray, Love. She's looking at this book as she's making copies, and she looks at it and she throws it in the trash, and she says to herself at that moment, "I can never top that book." This story builds on that TED Talk where she was talking about these questions that people would bring to her about, isn't she afraid of not being able to top her previous book? Or isn't she afraid what she writes after her successful book is not going to matter? Seth's story of Elizabeth throwing this book or this manuscript in the trash because she was fearful that it would never measure up to her previous book shows just what can happen when we get too attached to the outcome. Now, on a personal note, I understand very clearly what it means to get attached to the outcome. Several years ago, I had dropped out of school and decided to make an iOS app. I was kind of in a tough spot because I left a full-time job to focus completely on school. When school didn't really work out, I decided to work on an app that I had been working on as a side project. Not having a job, not going to school, I was in a pretty desperate position. I needed something to work really bad, and I needed some version of success. This idea of attachment to outcomes really hits home in this story, in that I desperately needed something to work. I needed success. I had left a stable job in order to pursue school full time in hopes that I could complete school, graduate, and get a job somewhere. And so when none of that worked out, I needed this app to succeed. I was extremely discouraged because of what had happened with leaving work and then having to leave school. I had so much riding on the success of this app, it put a lot of weight on me in a way that I could never have imagined. By needing the outcome of this app to be such a huge success, I was almost assuring its demise. It was going to fail because there was so much pressure on me to perform and for this app to be a wild success that I couldn't take the pressure. This idea of attachment to outcome really hits home for me. Just like Elizabeth Gilbert, I felt the weight and the pressure of trying to deliver something. And this pressure to deliver ultimately kept me from delivering. Anytime we attach our well-being and our happiness to something like a piece of our work, we are setting ourselves up for failure, because that pressure of needing that to work out in the way we think is creating a situation where we're just going to be dissatisfied. If it's anything but wildly successful, it's going to be disappointing. But as a creative, you're going to have a lot of different projects that don't work out. They simply don't. They don't land. They're not well received. Something doesn't work about them. And so you're going to have far greater projects that are a failure than that are wildly successful. And so when we place so much pressure on a certain project to be wildly successful, we are just setting ourselves up to either burn out or quit or get discouraged. I think as creators, this idea is really important, that we learn to separate ourselves, or we learn to detach ourselves from certain outcomes surrounding our work. That's it for this video. We'll talk to you in the next one.